Los Angeles in the late 1960s was a city of contradictions. On one hand, it was a glittering beacon of opportunity, sun-drenched beaches, and the music and fashion of the counterculture revolution. On the other, it was a city hiding dark alleyways of crime, despair, and manipulation. Amid this kaleidoscope of rebellion and innocence, a man named Charles Manson began weaving a web that would ensnare some of the most vulnerable young people in America and eventually terrorize a nation. Manson was not striking in appearance. He was thin, with sunken eyes that seemed to pierce into the souls of those around him. Yet there was a magnetic pull to his presence. He spoke with an unsettling mix of charm, menace, and prophecy, offering both comfort and control. For those who felt lost, he was a savior. For others, a dangerous predator. He promised a life of freedom, love, and purpose, but only if one surrendered completely to his will. By 1967, Manson had begun assembling what would later be called the Manson family, a loosely connected commune of young men and women living in the desert outside Los Angeles. They came from broken homes, troubled pasts, or a hunger for belonging. The family embraced an idyllic vision of communal living, sharing meals, working together, and experimenting with drugs. But beneath the surface, Manson's ideology was far from innocent. He preached a twisted philosophy he called helter-skelter, borrowing the name from a song by the Beatles and reinterpreting it as a prophecy of an impending apocalyptic race war. According to Manson, only the family would survive this chaos, and they would emerge to rule over the ashes of society. But first, he needed loyal soldiers willing to commit unspeakable acts on his command. Life in the desert camp was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Days began with group discussions where Manson would lecture on society, sin, and the sins of the outside world. He used drugs like LSD and mescaline to weaken the boundaries of his followers' minds, blurring the line between reality and hallucination. Nightly gatherings involved chanting, dancing, and hypnotic rituals designed to deepen dependence on him. Each young person became a puzzle piece in his growing empire of manipulation. Among the earliest members were Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Tex Watson, and a handful of other young women who would later participate in the murders. Their transformation was gradual but inevitable. They began as curious, impressionable teenagers seeking love and freedom. Under Manson's control, fear and devotion intertwined. Any hesitation or dissent was met with subtle intimidation or public humiliation. Over time, their identities were replaced by the family's collective will, Manson's will. Even at this early stage, Manson's capacity for psychological manipulation became apparent. He isolated his followers from their families, encouraging them to cut ties with the outside world. He framed himself as both God and guide, telling his followers that the outside society was corrupt, decadent, and doomed. Every act of obedience was rewarded, every doubt met with pressure, guilt, or threats. This relentless conditioning made his young disciples dependent on him for their emotional and moral guidance. The first hints of violence began subtly. A neighbor who visited the desert camp recalled seeing a young woman being berated by Manson, her tears mingling with the red dust of the desert. Another time, a member brandished a knife during an argument over a stolen car. The violence was contained, but symbolic. It was a seed planted in fertile soil. Manson's followers learned that aggression was not only tolerated, it was expected. It was a prelude to the horrors to come. As 1968 drew to a close, the family migrated closer to Los Angeles, drawn by the allure of the city's vibrant music scene and Manson's obsession with fame. He dreamed of a career in music, convinced that he and his followers could manipulate society through the very culture they admired. He often spent hours studying pop culture, reading newspapers, and dissecting the lives of wealthy, famous individuals, identifying those he believed were decadent or deserving of punishment. Manson's influence over his followers was total. They lived in a world where his word was law, where reality was filtered through his perspective. Every action, from mundane chores to moral decisions, was dictated by him. The family's communal life was a theater of psychological control. Songs were sung not for joy, but to reinforce allegiance. Meals were consumed not for sustenance, but to prove obedience. Rituals were performed not for spiritual growth, but to reinforce Manson's dominance. By early 1969, the stage was set for tragedy. Manson began speaking of a war that would engulf the nation, one he believed could be triggered through violence. He identified specific households as targets, not because of personal grievances, but as symbolic acts to ignite fear and chaos. The family, now fully conditioned to his ideology, accepted these instructions without hesitation. Obedience was no longer a choice, it was a compulsion rooted in fear, love, and indoctrination. Throughout Part 1, the tension builds steadily. Readers witness the slow but inexorable transformation of innocent youth into tools of terror, manipulated by one man's warped vision. The seeds of chaos have been sown, and Los Angeles unknowingly awaits the storm. By the end of this section, the audience is left with a chilling understanding. A charismatic man, armed with psychological mastery and a distorted sense of destiny, has created a family capable of unimaginable violence.
By the spring of 1969, the Manson family had moved from the dusty isolation of desert communes to the bustling, sun-drenched neighborhoods of Los Angeles. The city's palm-lined streets and Hollywood glamour offered temptation and opportunity, but for the family, they also provided the stage for a far darker purpose. Here, under the bright Californian sun, Charles Manson's influence over his followers reached terrifying new heights. Life within the family had evolved into a relentless cycle of obedience and indoctrination. Daily existence was a hypnotic rhythm of ritual and routine. Mornings began with long discussions led by Manson, where he dissected societal corruption, race tensions, and his vision of an impending apocalypse he called helter-skelter. He claimed the world was on the brink of collapse, and only his disciples would survive. Followers like Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Tex Watson were fully immersed in this ideology. Each day blurred the line between loyalty and subjugation. Personal boundaries dissolved. Decisions that once seemed moral or reasonable were now filtered through the lens of Manson's worldview. The family's members no longer questioned, they acted. Their devotion was absolute, reinforced by hallucinogenic drugs, peer pressure, and Manson's merciless psychological manipulation. The desert communes and Hollywood Hills hideaways became laboratories of control. Manson would often conduct sessions lasting hours, teaching obedience through repetition, humiliation, and fear. Songs were written and sung to reinforce loyalty. Every small task, washing dishes, preparing meals, or cleaning homes, was a test of submission. Those who faltered were chastised publicly, their failures magnified to ensure the others internalized the lesson. The family was not a mindless mob, however. Each member had a story, a motivation, and an inner conflict. Susan Atkins, for instance, came from a troubled home and sought love and acceptance. Under Manson's guidance, she became both adoring and fearful, struggling with the darkness she was being asked to embrace. Patricia Krenwinkel was equally malleable, drawn by the promise of belonging but slowly shedding her own moral compass. Tex Watson, a young man with charisma and intelligence, became one of Manson's most willing enforcers, molded into a lethal instrument by unwavering loyalty and indoctrination. Manson's obsession with fame and cultural domination intensified. He frequently studied the music industry, dissecting how the rich and powerful could influence society. He convinced his followers that a single act of violence, carefully executed, could trigger fear, destabilize society, and ignite the race war he prophesied. He selected targets not at random, but as symbols of a society he despised, people whose visibility and wealth made them ideal vessels for his message. Drug use was integral to this process. LSD, marijuana, and other hallucinogenics were administered regularly, blurring perception and weakening resistance. Under these substances, the family became increasingly malleable, their sense of reality bending to Manson's will. Nights were spent in hypnotic chants, dancing in circles, or listening to Manson's sermons until the followers were physically exhausted but mentally pliable. By the time plans for murder were set in motion, the family had become fully desensitized to both obedience and violence. Yet the tension was always present. Not every member was comfortable with Manson's ideology, and some wrestled with guilt, fear, and doubt. These internal conflicts created a subtle psychological tension, moments when hesitation flickered in their eyes, when fear almost broke through the veil of devotion. Manson was quick to notice and exploit these cracks, turning insecurity into deeper dependence on his guidance. He framed dissent as betrayal, making followers complicit in the cult's escalating crimes out of both loyalty and terror. In June 1969, the cult began scouting potential targets. Manson's instructions were cryptic but chilling. Wealthy, prominent, or visible individuals were to be punished symbolically, to serve as sparks for the chaos he envisioned. Surveillance became a daily activity. Members observed homes, noting schedules, entrances, and vulnerabilities. The meticulousness of this planning demonstrated the family's evolution from disorganized commune to a calculated criminal network. During this period, Manson's charisma became increasingly hypnotic. He framed every act of obedience as a moral or spiritual duty. A small act, like cleaning the house or preparing a meal, was elevated to a demonstration of loyalty. Even violence became ritualized in their minds, not a crime, but a necessary step toward fulfilling a cosmic prophecy. The audience watching this unfold is drawn into the psychological web, seeing how ordinary young people were transformed into instruments of terror through manipulation, drugs, and devotion. The tension rises steadily. Scenes depict the family laughing together, sharing communal meals, and dancing under the stars, an idyllic image that masks a chilling reality. Manson's shadow hangs over every moment, a reminder of the omnipresent control he wields. Through this juxtaposition, the audience feels the growing unease. Beneath the veneer of love and freedom lies a mind warped by obsession and the threat of violence. By July 1969, the family's descent into darkness was nearly complete. Manson had begun delivering more direct instructions. He told his followers that fear and chaos could be unleashed through acts of murder, framing these atrocities as both spiritual acts and tools of revolution. At first, the followers wavered, grappling with morality, but their loyalty, once tested and reinforced, held firm. The audience sees a final transformation, the point at which devotion surpasses conscience and fear binds obedience even tighter. Manson's obsession with the city's elite intensified. He identified homes in Los Angeles as symbolic targets, and the family began rehearsing in small ways, mimicking violence during drug-fueled sessions to desensitize themselves. Each rehearsal, each step closer to action, ratchets tension for the audience, leaving them breathless and apprehensive.
The night of August 8th to 9th, 1969, began like any other in Los Angeles. Quiet streets, the distant hum of traffic, and the warm, dry air settling over the city. But behind the manicured gates of Hollywood Hills, terror was about to strike. The Manson family, fully immersed in Charles Manson's dark vision, moved with calculated purpose, carrying out a series of murders that would shock the nation. Manson himself did not enter the home of their first target that night, but his presence loomed over every action. Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten were the instruments of his will. The followers moved with eerie precision, their nerves numbed by drugs and obedience, their moral compass shattered by months of psychological conditioning. They carried knives, hammers, and other instruments of death, their minds trained to carry out the impossible with unwavering loyalty. Their first stop was the home of Sharon Tate, the rising actress and wife of director Roman Polanski. She and her friends were unsuspecting, enveloped in the innocence of youth and privilege. The family's arrival was sudden and violent. Within minutes, the home erupted into chaos. Cries of fear pierced the night, mingling with the distorted rationalizations whispered by the attackers, acts of obedience framed as righteous duty, horrors justified as steps toward helter-skelter. Susan Atkins, wielding a knife, moved with a frightening detachment. Patricia Krenwinkel followed, driven by fear and fanatic devotion. Tex Watson, the most calculating of the group, ensured the plan was executed efficiently, suppressing hesitation. Their actions were choreographed by months of Manson's psychological conditioning, each movement a product of devotion, fear, and indoctrination. The victims had little time to react. Panic and disbelief coursed through the room as the young actress and her friends faced unimaginable terror. The family's violence was brutal, their methods methodical. Yet, amid the horror, the attackers were calm in their minds, convinced that they were carrying out a higher purpose, a deluded prophecy of apocalypse and race war. Outside, the night remained deceptively quiet. The city was unaware that terror had arrived in its most glamorous enclave. Sirens had not yet sounded, and the laughter and music of Hollywood parties continued oblivious to the horror within the Tate home. This contrast heightened the tension, emphasizing how abruptly innocence can be shattered by human malevolence. After leaving the Tate residence, the family did not pause. Their night of terror continued to the home of Lino and Rosemary LaBianca, wealthy socialites chosen by Manson for their symbolic value. Again, the same combination of drugs, devotion, and fear drove the followers to commit acts of violence beyond imagination. Inside the LaBianca home, the murders were executed with chilling precision, punctuated by a sense of ritualistic madness. Messages were scrawled in blood, a signature of the family's apocalyptic message intended to shock, terrify, and leave the city in confusion and fear. Throughout the night, the psychological tension is palpable. Even within the family, moments of hesitation flickered, subtle, almost imperceptible. But Manson's indoctrination had removed the option of retreat. Doubt was crushed under loyalty, fear, and the overpowering presence of his leader's ideology. The followers had become instruments, carrying out acts that were no longer morally theirs, but extensions of Manson's warped mind. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Neighbors discovered the bodies, some still moving in final, desperate moments, others cold and lifeless. The city awoke to a horror beyond comprehension, a Hollywood actress and her friends slaughtered in their own home, and another family similarly attacked hours later. Media outlets exploded with coverage, calling it the most shocking crime Los Angeles has ever seen. Public panic spread quickly, fueled by fear, speculation, and the grotesque nature of the murders. Investigators arrived on the scenes, confronting the unimaginable. Evidence suggested multiple perpetrators, and the brutality left little doubt of the premeditated nature of the crimes. But the motives remained a puzzle. The victims were famous, wealthy, and young, yet there was no personal connection. It seemed random, senseless, until the investigators began to uncover the thread of the Manson family's influence. Manson himself maintained a chilling distance. He did not enter the homes, but his instructions had been followed without deviation. From the outside, he appeared calm, almost casual, yet his control over his followers was complete. Through fear, devotion, and psychological dominance, he had orchestrated one of the most infamous, nightmarish events in American history. The impact on Los Angeles was immediate. News of the murder spread like wildfire. People locked their doors, neighborhoods whispered with fear, and the media fanned the flames of public panic. Hollywood, usually a symbol of glamour and fantasy, became a locus of terror. The killings shattered the illusion of safety even in the most affluent communities, leaving residents grappling with the reality that violence could arrive at any doorstep, instigated by the twisted vision of a single man. In the weeks following the murders, the family retreated into their hideouts, trying to maintain normalcy while law enforcement began their investigation. Members carried the psychological burden of the night's events, though Manson's influence muted guilt and fear. Each person wrestled with the tension between moral awakening and complete devotion, a struggle that would eventually unravel in the courtroom, but for now, their obedience held firm. The city of Los Angeles had barely begun to process the shock of the murders when law enforcement embarked on a painstaking investigation that would eventually uncover the horrifying truth behind the killings. Detectives faced an unprecedented puzzle, a crime so brutal, so calculated, yet seemingly random. At first, motive was elusive. Sharon Tate and her friends had no connection to Charles Manson, and the LaBiancas appeared as arbitrary victims. But the methodical nature of the attacks suggested more than a spontaneous crime. It pointed to a sinister orchestration. Investigators began piecing together a web of evidence, fingerprints, hairs, and strands of confessions whispered in corners. The investigation gradually led them to the Manson family, a ragtag group of devoted followers whose lives were wholly under the influence of their charismatic and terrifying leader. Interviews with neighbors, family members, and acquaintances painted a picture of manipulation, drugs, and psychological coercion, slowly revealing the depth of Manson's hold over his followers. The arrest of the family marked a turning point in the case. Police raided their various hideouts, uncovering a mixture of disarray, ritualistic paraphernalia, and documents outlining Manson's apocalyptic philosophies. The followers were detained, each displaying a mixture of fear, confusion, and an eerie calm. The investigators recognized the danger of underestimating the psychological control Manson wielded. He had turned ordinary young men and women into instruments of terror, capable of committing unspeakable acts without hesitation. As the legal process began, the media spotlight intensified. Manson's name became synonymous with evil, and the public fascination with the trial grew. Courtroom proceedings were broadcast widely, turning the trial into a spectacle unlike anything before. Inside the courtroom, Manson's charisma remained apparent even as his crimes were laid bare. He manipulated not only his followers, who were now defendants themselves, but also the court, the press, and the audience watching every word and gesture. The testimony of family members was both shocking and revealing. Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Tex Watson provided first-hand accounts of Manson's influence, detailing the months of manipulation, drugs, and psychological control that had driven them to commit murder. Their confessions highlighted the terrifying reality. These young people had been molded by a singularly malevolent mind, their individual morality erased and replaced by Manson's twisted ideology. The trial was a study in contrasts, Manson's calm, almost theatrical demeanor against the horror and grief of the victims' families. As witnesses described the night of the murders, the public could hardly comprehend the depth of the depravity and control. Each revelation intensified the sense of disbelief. How could ordinary youth be transformed into killers under the influence of one man? The courtroom became a theater of human psychology, morality, and the consequences of blind devotion. Ultimately, justice was served in the legal sense. Charles Manson and several of his followers were convicted of murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Sentences were handed down, initially including death, later commuted to life imprisonment after California temporarily abolished the death penalty. The verdict brought a measure of closure, but the emotional and cultural scars would linger for decades. The legacy of the Manson family killings extended far beyond the courtroom. Los Angeles, and indeed the world, had witnessed the shattering of innocence. The idealism of the 1960s, peace, love, and free expression, was replaced with fear, suspicion, and an understanding of the fragility of safety. Homes that once symbolized glamour and privilege now carried the shadow of terror. Families locked their doors, neighborhoods whispered rumors, and a pervasive anxiety settled over Hollywood. Culturally, the Manson murders influenced media, art, and literature for generations. The narrative of a charismatic cult leader manipulating devoted followers became a recurring theme in films, books, and documentaries. The story of Helter Skelter served as both cautionary tale and fascination, a grim reminder of the power of influence and the danger of fanaticism. Psychologists studied Manson's methods, criminal justice experts analyzed the family's dynamics, and the public remained captivated by the horror that had erupted so suddenly in their midst. Even decades later, the Manson family murders continue to provoke reflection. They demonstrate how vulnerable human beings can be when faced with a manipulative, charismatic leader. They reveal how ideology, fear, and loyalty can warp morality, transforming otherwise ordinary people into instruments of unspeakable violence. The events are a haunting study of psychology, culture, and crime, echoing long after the city of Los Angeles had begun to heal. The final scene is a sobering reflection. Manson, imprisoned for life, remains a symbol of manipulation, terror, and the dark potential of human influence. His followers, many of whom would eventually seek forgiveness or reconciliation with the past, serve as reminders of both vulnerability and resilience. The city of Los Angeles, once glittering with carefree promise, bears the lasting imprint of that summer of 1969, a cautionary tale of innocence lost and evil unleashed. Closing reflection. The story ends with a lingering question that haunts the audience. How could the lives of young, seemingly ordinary individuals be twisted into instruments of horror by a single man's ideology? The Manson family killings were not merely crimes, they were a study in devotion, manipulation, and the terrifying power of a charismatic leader over human minds. The events remain a chilling reminder that evil can emerge anywhere, often hidden beneath charm, charisma, and the promise of belonging. The audience is left with a mixture of horror, fascination, and reflection. Los Angeles will never forget the summer of 1969 when innocence was shattered and a city learned the cost of blind devotion. The Manson family killings remain etched into history, not only for the crimes themselves, but for the enduring lessons about power, psychology, and the human capacity for both influence and destruction.